Alright guys, well here we are, the first MMO of the Final Fantasy franchise, Final Fantasy XI, finally in this 11th month of the year. It's insane that I've been doing it this long, and I'll say right off the bat that it is super weird that I have to clarify that this is the first MMO in the series, especially being a mainline game. So what does Final Fantasy XI achieve? Well, before we get into that, let's get in some of the more crunchy bits of the release data and the development, and it's quite different from a normal Final Fantasy game. So, Final Fantasy XI was first announced at the Square Millennium event in January of 2000, along with Final Fantasy IX and Final Fantasy X, this being their three-pronged approach to give players and fans something from the past with Final Fantasy IX, something from the future with Final Fantasy X, and something else entirely being this Final Fantasy MMO for the internet age. The developers and producers are pretty different from those in the previous installments of the game, as this is still an ongoing project, so several people have kind of filtered in and out. Several directors and producers have changed since its inception, and I'll go over those briefly. We have Koichi Ishii, I'm sorry if I pronounced that. He originally worked on the game from 99 until 2003. For those that aren't familiar, Koichi Ishii is the father of the Seiken Densetsu games, known as the Mana line of games, as well as working on the other line of games that we don't have very much these days, and that's Saga Frontier. From 2003 to 2008, Nobuyaki maybe took over the role. From 2008 to 2010, we get Koichi Ogawa, that is a different Koichi. And 2010, we have Akihiko Matsui, who directed the project, and he is well known for a variety of Square games, starting with Final Fantasy IV, 5, he did some of the Romancing Saga games, Chrono Trigger, Saga Frontier, Legend of Mana, and even he is currently working on Final Fantasy XIV. So those were the directors here. We're going to the producers. They were Hiromichi Tanaka from 1999 during development to 2012, which was quite a run, I gotta say. Akihiko Matsui from 2012 until now, 2017. And before I move on, there's something that I want to point out. That Hiromichi Tanaka and many others came from this dream team. And that dream team is the prominent team that consists of 5 major people and a lot of other people. But the 5 people are Akira Toriyama, yes, that Akira Toriyama from Dragon Ball fame and Dragon Quest fame as well. Nobuo Uematsu, who I should not have to give any introduction at all. We also have Yuji Horii and Kazuhiko Aoki, and Hironobu Sakaguchi, but they had many people working under them as well with different projects, and some of those projects were Chrono Trigger and Chrono Cross. Now, why am I bringing this up? So the long story cut short is that this game, Final Fantasy XI, is a huge, major reason why we don't have more Chrono games. And it's the fact that a lot of them basically left those series, came from that quote-unquote dream team, it at this point is dissolved, and they started working on Final Fantasy XI, so no more Chrono games for us, because they said that they didn't want to give any more Chrono games if they don't have those 5 core members and the people working under them that made those absolute classic masterpieces. So if you didn't know that, now you do, and you know, if you're like me, maybe a little bit frustrated that we don't have a Chrono game, which is actually my favorite series that Square produces, even above Final Fantasy for sure. So all right, I'm sorry, that's just something I had to get out. I've been waiting for this Final Fantasy XI episode because it impacts the Chrono series so much. But all right, back to Final Fantasy XI. The inception for Final Fantasy, being an MMO of all things, is actually thanks to Square's decision, their terrible decision, to start Square Pictures, and doing so spent much of the time creating a base of operations in Hawaii. Of course, at that time, we know that Spirits Within came out and bombed and, you know, did some bad stuff, but if you're a huge fan of the MMO, of this game in particular, Final Fantasy XI, you owe a lot to Spirits Within despite its quality as a movie, because Hironobu Sakaguchi began playing EverQuest while they were over in Hawaii, kind of kicking this Square Picture thing into gear. And this really did inspire Final Fantasy XI, as it would eventually be known. So the development mantra for Final Fantasy XI was all platforms and media, really pushing it for all gamers. And you know what? At least for a while, they did actually pull it off brilliantly. And also a little bit of trivia here is that they wanted Final Fantasy XI to be one of the Final Fantasy-iest, I guess that's not a word, but it is now, of all of the Final Fantasy games, basically going back to square one, implementing the things that they couldn't do way back in the NES era. So this is really a return to form from the original inception of the franchise itself. Several composers worked on this game as well. Naoshi Mitsuda, Kumi Tanioka, maybe, and of course the one and only Nobuo Uematsu. And this game has amazing music. It's one of my favorites. So as the game started, being developed and came to fruition, it was released on a multitude of platforms, which actually did offer cross-platform play. And let's be real here, it's still a really, really big deal to have a game that's cross-platform with like PC, PlayStation, Xbox, all of that stuff. It was released on PlayStation 2 in Japan on May 16th, 2002, and in March 23rd, 2004 for the West. Now, this is really important because the PlayStation 2 got their online adapter basically for Final Fantasy XI. I mean, there were some other games that used it, the PlayStation 2 version of Tribes, but otherwise just a handful of games used this. Most people bought it for the Final Fantasy XI aspect of it. The PC version of the game was released on November 7th, 2002 for Japan and October 28th, 2003 for North America, and on September 17th, 2004 for the EU. A weird version was developed for the 360 and it was released almost simultaneously for all peoples of the earth within a few days of each other in mid-April of 2006. The reason I mentioned that it's a weird thing is because Play Online, that service, didn't really work well with Xbox Live service. They didn't play very nice, and this resulted in the game being quarantined, I guess would be the best word for it. If you bought it for 360, you were playing with 360 players, and that was it. So in that aspect, it wasn't really a cross-platform kind of deal. Finally, the Steam version came out on April 19th, 2013 for every region, and this is the first time that I get to say this, but this game, at least part of it, was shut down on March 21st, 2016 worldwide for the PlayStation 2 and Xbox 360. It is super sad from a game preservationist point of view to have a Final Fantasy game no longer be playable on a particular platform. And as much as I do love Final Fantasy XI, and I have a lot of very good memories with the game, I just don't like this being a mainline Final Fantasy game for that purpose, because it will eventually get shut down and that's going to be super sad. So anyway, all right, that's pretty complicated for a release, but what about the game itself? What did the game do? How did it play? All of that. I guess first I'd like to be transparent about this subject. I was a diehard player up until I believe it's Treasures of At Ergon. I played the Chains of Promethea expansion, and then beyond that I don't really have a lot of experience. Kind of funny little story for me. The same week that this game came out, I got deathly ill and I missed class and nobody really came to see how I was doing because they thought I was just skipping to play Final Fantasy XI, and that was not true. I nearly died. So that is something that they remind me of until this day, 15 years later or something. Anyway, back to the game. I have a ton of first-hand experience during the game's infancy, but how the game is today, all of the kind of newer expansions, I don't have a lot of first-hand knowledge of. So if for whatever reason you aren't aware of how MMOs work, essentially the game is constantly being updated, tweaked, and adding new stuff to the game. So any idea that I have of the game is just going to be coming from my early days and experiences from it. Just real quick, Final Fantasy XI requires a standalone program, Play Online, to update and run the game itself. And the last video was the Play Online video, so if you haven't checked that out, go and do that. It's an interesting program. Anyway, let's go over the basics of the game itself. First, this game is an MMO, a massively multiplayer online game where thousands of participants participate in the same areas of the game. And at this point, Final Fantasy XI was the third, I would say, incredibly well-populated MMO. You could make arguments for other games, but I'm thinking of EverQuest, Dark Age of Camelot, and then came along Final Fantasy XI. At this point, we did not have World of Warcraft or EverQuest 2, and yeah, those would eventually come along and kind of take up the market, especially World of Warcraft, but regardless, this is about Final Fantasy XI. Most MMOs work the same way with this kind of auto-targeting system, which plays nice with server latency. A lot of the times you're not going to see MMOs being a real-time game, specifically just because of thousands of people and how the servers have to process the data. It's just unrealistic. That's why you only get online shooters with very small amounts of people. Of course, these days it has been upped quite a bit. But anyway, this game being an MMO does actually feel like a Final Fantasy game in contrast to all the other MMOs at the time. They really did give it that Final Fantasy kind of polish and veneer, and it operates with some familiarity. If you knew what a Final Fantasy game was before this, like Final Fantasy 9, 8, 7, all that, you still operated the game, the battles and everything with that kind of menu selection system. The game, as you might expect, is where you go and visit towns and get quests and level up and all of the good stuff that makes MMOs. And interestingly enough, this game is actually the first to pull off battles with no transition screens taking place between like your discovery, exploration maps, and then your battle maps. Specifically to the Final Fantasy franchise, of course. So what Final Fantasy does well here is bringing Final Fantasy online, and there could have been many different ways to do this, to innovate on it, but having a core Final Fantasy experience was at the top of their to-do list. That said, you can probably guess that we have jobs, and in fact, yes we do. It's a throwback to the original Final Fantasy game, especially whenever you create your first character, because you have the holy sextet of jobs that are initially available. And those are the warrior, the monk, the white mage, the black mage, the red mage, and the thief. But even more so, the game does have a sub-job system, which is kind of interesting, which functions as a backup essentially, allowing for different combinations of abilities. Sub-job is effectively half of your main job's level. So let's say you have a level 40 job and you pick another job. If you've leveled it up, you can get all the skills and everything that would have been from level 20 of that job. This in theory allows for hundreds of different combinations, but during actual play, during the real, nitty-gritty of it, basically you are required to pair up specific jobs if you ever want to get a party. So let's say Paladin needed a warrior sub-job, or even maybe a white mage. Red mage would want to have a warrior, white mage, black mage, something like that. You wouldn't do well to have like a Paladin and then a black mage as your sub-job. Nobody liked that. I mean, you could do it, but you would never get parties. And in this game, finding friends, social interaction, having parties are vital, at least in the early days of the game. Speaking of paladins, we do have these advanced jobs that can be acquired through different quests whenever you reach a certain level. Most of these jobs should be familiar to you. We have the Paladin, the Dark Knight, the Beastmaster, the Bard, the Ranger, the Samurai, the Ninja, the Dragoon, the Summoner, the Blue Mage, best Blue Mages in Final Fantasy, in my opinion. We have the Corsair, we have the Puppet Master, Dancer, Scholar, Geomancer, and Rune Fencer, Rune Knight, if you want to call it that. I believe the Puppet Master and debatably the Corsair are the first of their kind to appear in the franchise, although you could make an argument for the Corsair being like a gambler. So along with those classes, we do have 5 completely different unique races here. These races completely try to make the Final Fantasy genre, the franchise, their own thing. And in doing so, we have moved beyond the tired Tolkien-esque fantasy with elves and dwarves and all of that. So the first big race that we have is the Hume, which is your basic human, which completely contradicts what I just said. So, okay, maybe all of the races aren't completely unique, but humans, like in many other games, they tend to be your more balanced race in terms of stats. Next, we have the Elven, which is totally derailing what I said earlier about getting away from the Tolkien-esque stuff. They are totally not elves, but they kind of are. They do have a little bit different place than what you would expect an elf to have, though, is they have a lot of strength and mind magic, whatever. So they aren't necessarily like your traditional elves with dexterity and agility. They make good paladins and good healers, but have a little intellect, so you wouldn't want to be like a black mage or something. Next up is the Mithra, which is a race of, there's no other way to put it, it's a race of catgirls, which I'm sure exacerbated the furry fan base, but interestingly enough, only females of this race are playable, and they excel at what you might expect, being completely dexterous and having lots of agility, making them awesome thieves and ninjas and those types of characters. Our fourth race here, we have the Galka. It's essentially a huge, bulky, muscular, like, bear man character type of thing. They sport a high vitality bolstering their HP, but are terrible at any kind of magic due to having a supreme deficiency in their MP. Finally, we have the little Taru, which are our gnomish or halfling-esque characters who excel at magic, all the magic. They're your magic people. Alright, so again, like the classes being basically required to pair up to get a good position in a party, most of those parties are also going to expect that your class matches your race. So there's a lot of people that, at least when I played, they did not like you being a Taru warrior or an elven black mage or something. They wanted a Taru mage, they wanted an elven warrior, etc. So that kind of sucked because it really took some of the fun out of the game, trying these different things, but that's just how it rolls, right? Battles in this game similarly work to other Final Fantasies and other MMOs. There was an ATB system, so it does really give it similar feel to most other MMOs, assuming you select attack. In the background, you're gonna, eventually just keep on attacking, auto attack. Classes have different abilities and skills, and as you level up, you're gonna get more of those, as you might expect. There is a skill system associated completely with the different types of weapons that was really cool. So if you used a polearm, you would have different skills than somebody that would use like a sword or something on top of your already gained class skills. And the class abilities obviously take cues from the previous games, but a few cool new ideas came about, which I really enjoyed. For instance, summoning. If you're a summoner, you can have your summon follow you as a pet, and they looked really cool, and that's one of the deficiencies of the newer MMO, Final Fantasy XIV. I was super psyched to be a summoner, but that was just depressing. Same thing with the Dragoon here. You can have a little dragon following you. Very cool stuff. The game in its early days, I've heard it's gotten much better today, but it was a very, very slow-paced game of leveling, mostly because you had to have a good group to level quickly, and even then, it was pretty slow. You could chain enemies together, and as you chained them, chaining being like defeating one and immediately defeating another, keeping on going, you would get a huge, huge boost of, bonus experience doing that, but you had to have a party for that. that soloing, at least probably above level 20, was pretty much unviable completely. What I do have to say is, barring the issues with people, essentially forcing you to be a Taru mage or whatever, the community on a whole was basically the best community I've ever played with in an MMO. I made some incredibly good friends online just chatting it up whenever I was sitting as a Dragoon, filthy Dragoon, waiting for my party. The concept of link shells in this game permitted you to talk with all kinds of people. Link shells were basically like your guilds. You would get a link shell and then you would have access to a specific channel that you could just chat with all the other people with. And yeah, it was fun. Like, the game was definitely the most mature game that I had ever played. Similarly, following most MMOs, you do have a crafting system and an economy system. And this is really interesting because the game really relied heavily on the economy, and the different servers could vary completely wildly on very many different items. I actually can't stress how important this economy and crafting was to the game. It wasn't as important as, say, Star Wars Galaxies, but I mean, it was incredibly important because the big thing here is that you never really bought anything from NPC vendors. You may buy spells, but other than that, you always bought the best stuff from the people selling in the auction house. So there's a lot of interesting systems here. Delving into the more narrative aspects of the game, whenever you begin, you align yourself with one of 3 nations, which was Sandoria, Bastok, and Windurst, in an alliance to drive back these beast hordes. And of course, as you play throughout the game, the various storylines of each expansion, it really does feel like a classic Final Fantasy game in the terms of narrative being told. And that's the one thing that I really enjoyed about this game, is that we do still get that heavy story. Final Fantasy XIV, I think, does it even better than Final Fantasy XI, but Final Fantasy XI did bring it. And that's the one thing that these games have over other MMOs, is because whenever you play WoW or EverQuest or whatever, for me, I'd never really had a big connection to the story like I have with these games. But anyway, that's all I'll say about the story elements. Like most MMOs, several expansion packs slowly trickled out over the years, and I believe they're still even supporting them and making new expansion content. All in right now, there are 5 main expansions, the first of which is called The Rise of the Zillart, which most people don't even think of as an expansion, especially over here in the States, because it was released with the game itself. Like, you could not buy the Final Fantasy XI game without Rise of the Zillart over here. Going from there, we have the Chains of Promathia, which is where I, played, and that's kind of where I stopped. Then Treasures of At Urgan, and then Wings of the Goddess, and finally, most recently, we have the Seekers of Aduilin. Each expansion added various classes, storylines, items, all the stuff that you would expect from an expansion. They bumped up the level cap. Eventually, after the expansions came out, it settles at level 99 as far as I'm aware. Other various add-ons and main quest expansions, all of that stuff came with the expansions, and more recently, I've heard, like they're doing with Final Fantasy XIV, they're releasing a little bit of main content updates, I guess, in between the really big meaty expansions, which is always good. The game itself was definitely a success by all measures, as critics generally liked the game and the subsequent expansions. At its height, I believe in 2009, over 2 million active characters were being played. That's not necessarily 2 million accounts being played, but characters. For those that don't know, extra characters did cost a little bit of extra money, so they were actually raking in the cash quite a bit. Definitely praiseworthy, all things considered. And in June 2012, it was announced that Final Fantasy XI was the most profitable Final Fantasy game of all time, probably due to their subscription-based approach here. I'm not sure if that record still stands today with Final Fantasy XIV, because 14 is doing gangbusters, and the constant flow of content from Final Fantasy 15, offering it like as a games as a service or whatever they're calling it now, once again is an impressive feat. But Final Fantasy XI, let's give it credit. It held its own. It's a fantastic game. So, that's all I really can say about Final Fantasy XI. I personally have fond memories of the game, and it definitely provided something a bit different from the standard MMO fare at the time, if not just Final Fantasy-izing EverQuest. The game's music, like I said at the beginning, is absolutely top-notch, probably in my top 3 soundtracks from the franchise. This game is one that I surely will never forget. My only hope is that they eventually create a game or a version of the game that is an offline single-player for just preservation's sake. I'm not too happy about it being a major release, as the servers could be shut down at any time and you just lose access to the game forever. Like right now, I can go to my NES and play Final Fantasy 1. There's going to be a point in time later on where this game is going to shut down and you're never going to be able to play it again, which is kind of, it's disheartening. It sucks. I have heard that there's some mobile project in the works now that's kind of like a Final Fantasy XI single player, but I haven't really heard much more on that end. Enough of my rambling though. Thank you so much for watching this as we leave the month of Carbuncle behind and enter December. October, the month of the Phoenix, and unofficially, it's going to be the month of Ivalice. We're going to look at all the games under the Ivalice project and eventually end off with Final Fantasy XII itself. But before we do that, let's sit back and watch this incredibly awesome opening cinematic. It's one of the longest ever for the franchise, and it's one of the best ever. And again, thank you so much for watching.
In the 863rd year of the Crystal Era, Vana'diel was in the midst of a great war. Faced with invasion by the Shadow Lord and his hordes of beastmen, the leaders of the enlightened peoples united their forces in desperate alliance. They were the Kingdom of Sandoria, the Republic of Bastu, the Federation of Winders, and the Grand Duchy of Juno. Together, they struggled for survival in battle after battle as chaos engulfed the land.
Aldo, listen. You've got to climb.
Sis?
Can you lower yourself down?
I think so.